Western sanctions were designed with a pretty clear, aggressive goal: cripple hostile regimes by choking off their oil revenue. But a major new working paper we've been digging into shows this policy didn't just fail, it actually accidentally fueled this vast, shadowy global oil market. And now that market is shifting the balance of economic power and not in our favor.
Right. And when policymakers use sanctions, they think they're pulling a very precise lever to isolate an adversary. But this deep dive is so critical because it shows sanctions aren't just a political tool. They're a massive economic shockwave. They created a multi-billion-dollar illicit market from scratch.
So that's our mission today. We want to cut through all the geopolitical noise and really get into the mechanics of what's being called dark shipping. This refers to oil tankers that deliberately turn off their automatic identification system, their AIS transceivers.
They just go invisible.
Exactly. To evade detection while they transport sanctioned crude from places like Iran, Russia, Venezuela, you name it.
And we really need to analyze not just what this dark fleet is doing, but I think more importantly, why the West's conventional pressure is just fundamentally failing here. If the goal was to restrict their supply and cripple their revenues, well, the outcome has been the complete opposite. It's a powerful, parallel economic system run by the very nations we were trying to punish.
Okay, so let's define the problem first. How does this even work?
So the surge in this dark shipping is a direct one-to-one result of Western sanctions on oil routes. The tankers literally go dark, like you said, by disabling their AIs. That's the tech that broadcasts their location, their speed, their heading.
And without that, they're just a ghost on the map.
A total ghost. And they use this invisibility to load oil in sanctioned ports or, and this is a big one, conduct unauthorized ship-to-ship transfers. They call them STS transfers.
Right, out in the middle of the ocean where no one's watching.
Yep, high-risk zones. The Gulf of Guinea, international waters near Gibraltar, places like that. They just pull up next to each other and pump the oil across.
So how do researchers even identify these ships if they're trying so hard to be invisible?
Well, it's more of an art than a science. They use these really sophisticated data models that look for patterns. Things like unusual speeds or a ship just suddenly vanishing from the map in a suspicious area and then reappearing days later somewhere else.
So it's behavioral analysis, basically.
Exactly. And they found common characteristics. The ships involved tend to be older vessels, less valuable. They're often managed by smaller shell company type operators who can easily skirt compliance. And they're frequently registered under these high-risk flag states, the blacklist flags.
That's a huge red flag right there.
It's a massive signal that the vessel is actively trying to hide something.
And here is where the scale of this just becomes kind of staggering. Tracking these ships from 2017 all the way through 2023, the paper found the dark fleet averaged an astonishing 558 tankers.
Let that sink in for a second. 558. We're talking about roughly 1/4. 25% of the entire global crude oil tanker fleet, operating completely outside the law.
A quarter of the whole fleet. That's not a few rogue actors. That's a systemic infrastructure.
It is a systemic parallel logistics network. And the volume they move explains why it's so hard to stop. These dark ships transported an estimated 7.8 million metric tons of crude oil every single month.
Wow.
And if you compare that number to the official UN data, the researchers found that this illicit flow, this dark flow, accounted for about 43% of the total recorded world seaborne crude oil exports.
43%. So almost half the world's seaborne oil trade is effectively off the books.
Moving through an unregulated, untaxed, and unsanctioned network. So yeah, if the West's goal was to reduce global oil supply and cripple states like Russia, well, this dark fleet is the living, moving embodiment of that failure.
And we saw this play out perfectly after the G7 price cap, didn't we?
We did. That was the big test. December 2022, they implemented that $60 per barrel price cap on Russian crude. The idea was to slash Russia's wartime funding. And at first, it looked like it was working. Recorded global seaborne oil exports did drop sharply.
But the oil didn't just disappear.
Not at all. It just went dark. Sanctioned oil exports moving via this dark fleet more than doubled at the exact same time. The supply was just rerouted, moved underground, and this flood of illicit, cheap supply stabilized global oil prices.
Yeah.
Which, helped Western consumers, but it totally failed to cripple the sanctioned economies. The dark fleet neutralized the entire policy.
Okay, so let's talk about the money, the financial damage. This discounted oil has to be warping the global market.
It's the central mechanism. Because they're operating illegally, they have to sell cheap. These sanctioned crude flows typically traded anywhere from, say, $5 to $35 per barrel cheaper than the benchmarks like Brent or Urals.
That's a huge discount.
A massive discount. And the share of this dark shipped oil in the global trade just exploded. It went from about 13% before the Russia sanctions to 47% afterward.
47%. So you're saying almost half the global oil trade is now selling at a steep discount. That has to be putting massive downward pressure on all oil prices, WTI, Brent, everything.
It's an economic force we created but now have zero control over.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really fascinating because it leads to these asymmetric consequences for the U.S. and the EU.
Asymmetric? How so?
They react in completely opposite ways. And the reason is simple. The U.S. is a net oil exporter, while the EU is a massive net oil importer.
Okay, let's break that down. Start with the U.S. Global oil prices drop because of all this cheap dark oil. That means the WTI spot price goes down, and that must hurt our domestic oil producers.
It does. Their revenue drops. That's the obvious direct impact on the energy sector. But here's the surprising flip side. The paper shows the U.S. simultaneously benefits from lower import prices on manufactured goods.
Lower prices from where?
From China.
Wait, why would China be selling us stuff for cheaper?
Because China is the #1 customer for all this super cheap dark oil. Their energy costs, the literal cost of running their factories, just plummets. And they pass some of that savings on through cheaper exports to us. So this creates what economists call a supply-driven expansion in the U.S. It's characterized by deflationary pressure. So you get strong growth, but the goods you buy are getting cheaper because China's costs went down.
So to put it bluntly, we get cheaper stuff at Target, but we're basically subsidizing that by weakening our own energy producers and, more importantly, by funding China's manufacturing boom.
That's a perfect way to put it. Now, contrast that with the EU. They're net importers, so they face a totally different reality. At first, they get hit with higher energy costs that suppress their own industry. You'd expect inflation and stagnation, right?
Yeah.
Real stump.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the paper says the EU actually saw a net increase in output, which sounds completely backward.
It is counterintuitive. And the reason is, again, China. China's newly supercharged industrial machine, powered by that cheap Russian and Iranian oil, develops this massive appetite for intermediate goods,
Yeah.
high-tech components, machinery,
Stuff the EU is really good at making.
stuff the EU excels at. So this rising demand for EU products from China more than offsets the EU's own domestic energy problems.
So the EU gets an increase in output, but there's a catch.
Absolutely. The catch is that this surge in demand from abroad fuels demand-driven inflation in their producer prices. So Western sanctions effectively created two bizarre, confusing economic zones for its allies. The U.S. gets growth with deflationary help from China's cheap exports. The EU gets growth, but with inflationary pressure also fueled by China. It's a total economic mess born from a strategic blunder.
And this mess brings us straight to the undeniable winner in all of this, the one who wins the grand prize in this whole geopolitical mess.
The biggest winner, and it's not even close, is China. Honestly, this conclusion should be a 5-alarm fire for every policymaker in the West concerned about long-term strategy.
Give us the numbers. How much the benefit?
China was the single largest importer of this illicit crude. They brought in over 97 million metric tons of dark shipped oil between 2017 and 2023. That's a full 15% of all the sanctioned oil that was exported. It flowed right into their economy.
And access to that heavily discounted oil is basically a massive ongoing subsidy for their entire industrial base.
That's what it is. It slashed their production costs, and the paper shows a direct, measurable boost in their industrial output as a result.
So if we connect the dots here, sanctions that were meant to isolate states like Russia and Iran are instead being converted into cheap energy for China. We are subsidizing our main economic competitor.
We are actively strengthening their hand in the global supply chain. And at the same time, we're undermining the competitiveness of our own domestic manufacturing. It's a severe strategic failure. We're paying the price through all this economic distortion, while China is just reaping the profits.
So moving from the economics to the enforcement, or lack thereof, if this dark fleet is just sailing around with impunity, what is the West even doing about it?
Well, the enforcement mechanisms are proving to be, let's just say, politically explosive and operationally useless at this scale.
You're talking about naval actions, right? Seizing ships on the high seas.
Exactly. Take the fallout with Venezuela. The U.S. seized one of their oil shipments in international waters. Their foreign minister, Yvonne Gill, went straight to the UN Security Council and formally accused the U.S. of maritime piracy and a flagrant violation of international law.
Maritime piracy. I mean, that's an incredibly loaded term to use on the world stage.
It is. Now, the U.S. justified it, citing an illicit oil shipping network supporting foreign terrorist organizations. But the diplomatic cost is huge. You can deploy a warship, you can seize one tanker, but you create an international incident, and you've only taken one ship out of 558 off the water, and only temporarily.
It's not a scalable solution. It's like playing whack-a-mole on the world's oceans.
It is. And while we're doing that, these sanction regimes are getting way more sophisticated at bypassing the financial enforcement, too. They're not just hiding the ships, they're hiding the money.
How are they managing that?
Venezuela is the key case study here. They're selling their crude mainly to China, but they're not getting paid in dollars.
Hmm.
Crucially, they're accepting payment in digital assets, specifically stablecoins. That lets them sidestep the entire U.S. financial system.
So the moment we cut off their access to the dollar, they just move the trade onto the blockchain, which is faster, cheaper, and a lot harder to track and seize.
The adversary is adapting much faster than our enforcement agencies are. And that's why the experts in the source material are arguing for a fundamental shift in strategy. Forget the naval blockades. They're costly, they're controversial. The U.S. needs to shift its focus from the high seas to the digital economy. It's a financial war now, not a physical one.
So what does that look like? What's the plan?
It means enforcing the seizure of crypto wallets. It means working directly with the stablecoin issuers themselves, many of whom are centrally managed, funnily enough, to seize or even burn the digital assets held by sanctioned groups.
What do you mean by burn?
Burning means permanently destroying them, sending the digital coins to an inaccessible address on the blockchain. They're gone forever. And this is touted as being so much more cost-effective than deploying naval fleets to chase tankers around the globe.
Yeah.
You follow the money, not the ship.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener, and for our national strategy? We've seen that oil sanctions are not some simple foreign policy tool. They're a complex economic force that accidentally created a shadow market moving almost 8 million metric tons of oil every month. A failed strategy that's now subsidizing China's industrial dominance with cheap energy while we're stuck with the mess.
And it raises a really important question. These sanctions are systematically undermining global transparency, they're creating massive price distortions, and they are objectively failing to achieve their stated goal. They're allowing rogue regimes to survive and our main competitor to thrive. This whole approach needs a serious reevaluation.
So here's the thought we want to leave you with. If our conventional geopolitical pressure just pushes illicit trade onto the blockchain and at the same time accelerates the industrial power of our chief economic competitor, should Western powers abandon sanctions entirely? Or should we fundamentally shift our strategy away from the expensive, politically messy high seas and the piracy accusations to the digital stablecoin market, where we can literally destroy sanctioned wealth with a few keystrokes? That choice could define the future of economic warfare.